But, well, okay.
Sorry.
Recording. So anyway, with that said, I'm all ears as to what you guys think we should do in terms of the fee and lieu structure and what ballpark you think we should be in.
This is Dan. If I could ask a couple questions.
Sure.
First is there a difference? Is there planned to be a difference between what this fee in lieu would be for the development of rental product versus for sale product? Because the cost to build rental product is, severely less than it is condo product, right? Just the finishes and all those things. So the cost, 400% of SMI at 482,624 might not seem like a lot for a condo project, but for a rental project, the cost to build a unit is roughly half of that.
Okay.
So I think if there should, one comment would be, is there a chance to differentiate, because the cost is clearly differentiated?
So to just respond to that comment, I should have said this up front, but no, I hadn't considered that because I didn't know that. But one place I thought we may be going at the end of last meeting in terms of responses from the commissioners was that maybe we need some sort of graduated structure here or different structure. And so I am open to that option. I just don't know what the right numbers are.
Right. And then the second part of that question would be, I guess the 120,000 number is based on a family of 4.
Correct.
So if you're building, 1 bedrooms or 2 bedrooms, which typically wouldn't apply to a family of 4, are you using the same SMI?
Yes, that was my plan, just for simplicity's sake.
Right. But from a economics perspective as a developer, if the SMI for a family of 2 is 82,000 versus the 120, there's a huge difference in what the cost would be to build those units versus what you'd have to pay in the fee of lieu for a family of 4.
Okay.
Well, Dan, this is Art. The issue here is not the developer perspective on it. The issue is the state 830G and our objective to actually have developers build units. So I don't think that we can build into this a distinction, because obviously, and in fact, your 258 Pine proposal is a great example. If you lower that fee simply to accommodate apartments, the issue is that the town of New Canaan needs to comply with 830G. So the addition of additional units to the denominator is the key feature. The objective that we're trying to get to here is to ensure that new construction at a minimum does not do damage to the overall compliance objectives of meeting 830G.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think, as and Rick can talk a little more, we want to do, I think my gut is, and I guess this is a question too, is that the town wants to incentivize people to build the affordable units on site as opposed to pay the fee in lieu, right? But so that's why and that's our goal, is to try to build as many on site as we can, so that we can, work with this. But I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
And hey, Dan and Rick, can I just interject real quick? I know obviously what's on your mind is your project on Pine Street, but because we have commissioners here and not the whole commission, we can't talk specifically about that project. So I mean, you can use it as an example, but we're not, just so we're clear.
We understand. Yeah. It's just the easiest thing to use as an analogy.
No, I understand. I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Krista, I would recommend defining what state median income is, because believe it or not, there's more than one state median income. So the number you have in your slide, 120,656, is the state median income issued, I believe, by the Department of Health and Human Services for use in like childhood nutrition, stuff like that. It's not actually the state median income that's issued by HUD, which is what 830G is based off of. That number for 2021 is just over 100,000, like 100,300 or something like that.
Okay.
So this is very confusing area of, and I've gotten tripped up on this personally before, but you have, if you want to link it to 830G, you really need to use the HUD state median income.
Well, that would explain why I was always finding different numbers.
I think there's like 3 of them.
Yeah,
I
just
don't
type
know why.
HUD income limits into Google, you'll get it.
Okay. Okay, so I just put it into my spreadsheet real quickly, and to update what the slide says, 300% of SMI would be 300,900 per unit, and 400% of SMI would be 401,200 per unit. Just
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
it's
that's-
102,600 is the
Oh,
current
okay.
number.
I
okay.
couldn't remember the exact number, but I knew it was less than 120,000.
Yep.
Thank
Okay.
you.
The other editing comment I would make while we're on this is that the definition, the term median income is used a number of times in your zoning, proposed zoning text, but you don't say if it's state or area. So I
So-
assume you mean state, and so you should say state median income.
We have a definition in the definition section of our zoning regulations
Oh,
for
okay.
median income, and it uses, I'm pretty sure, the same as the state does, whichever is lesser, the state or the area.
Okay,
which obviously in our
perfect.
case is
Yep.
state.
Good.
And the only reason, so we started playing with state versus area in the fee in lieu of options, obviously because it's a different number, and we were trying to figure out which one would get us to the right number. But elsewhere, when we say it, we're referring to state because that's the lesser of the two.
It doesn't really matter which one you use to define the fee in lieu. I mean, Rick is really the consummate expert on this. But you're really, at this point in time, I think you're just seeking to a number. And I think I might have mentioned this during the zoning meeting. The towns that actually have a lot of fee in lieu used and generate a lot of fee in lieu and put a lot of fee in lieu to work, which is really mostly Stamford and to a lesser extent Norwalk, actually have lower buyouts. I think until Rick must know what the new formula is, but until recently, the formula in Stamford produced a number of about $220,000. And I think Westport's closer to 400. I don't think of it as the cost of construction per unit specifically, but it's really where is the developer indifferent? And I think most developers view the cost of construction as an affordable unit can produce the same income if you take out the land cost. So it's really purely the cost of construction. And as far as which is preferred on site or fee in lieu, that's been a debate that's gone on for probably years in Stamford. I know the preference for a long time was for on-site, but recently that's been relaxed. And I think what's actually as important as your dollar buyout fee in lieu cost is how is the money put to use? So the zoning board in Stamford, and I just know this because I know this because I just went through a funding round with them. They're very intently focused on leverage. So how much, when they get a fee in lieu proposal typically from a nonprofit, how much outside capital does that nonprofit bring, and how many units are they going to create for every dollar that they get from the zoning board? And that's really just as important. And that's not, and your regs are silent on that, and you shouldn't have regs on that. But the award process is extremely important.
Right. So for right now, like I said, we don't have a nonprofit presence building affordable housing in New Canaan. So we've relied on the housing authority to do the construction. And right now, as the regulations are written, the housing authority would be one of the few parties that could use the money that goes into the housing trust fund. This is on my list of things for the future that.
Well, you should, yeah, I mean, you should just know that if there were more fee in lieu available, there's an enormous ecosystem of very long-standing successful housing nonprofits in Stamford. And they would, I think any one of them would probably look at a project in New Canaan if they could get the funding.
Right, and so, yeah, that's on our list. I mean, we talked with the town planners in Greenwich earlier on in this process, and they were at the point, or maybe they've been at the point for a while, where they would fund nonprofit construction of affordable housing through their housing trust fund. And they said, I can't remember if it was Greenwich or Darien, but they would set, basically what their advice to us was the process of deciding who gets the money and how much they get can be complicated. So again, I've kind of, for the sake of simplicity, sidestepped that for now and said that's something we'll have to come back to later. But for now, we're collecting the fee in lieu of, and for now, basically the only entity that can be building with it will be the housing authority or the town, until we figure out some sort of process for disseminating that money.
So in order to maybe put a bow on this and move on, 400% of the SMI done with the HUD numbers at the 400, a little over 400,000, I think you should just, in my opinion, just go with it, because the fee in lieu numbers in Westport and the fee in lieu numbers in Stamford, I invented. And I just invented the numbers, and I invented them at a point in time and then indexed them. And what I did when I first did this 20 plus years ago was say, how much would it take to go out and buy a unit, buy a condominium, write it down, and then resell it or re-rent it, or whichever the case may be, to someone who could afford that amount, 50%. That's where we started. 50% of AMI is where all this started. So this is not, it wasn't based on the 830G. It was based on, practically speaking, if you could underwrite a unit by this amount, you could go out and buy one and put it in. And then you could work with a housing development fund or someone, and it was that it. So my suggestion, since there's so much other ground to cover, would be 400%. It's a little over 400,000. It's a dart at the wall, and it gets you off of that topic and onto the other topics, which I think will be more important.
Thanks for that push, Rick. I appreciate that.
Hey, Krista, can I just ask one question? I know Rick wanted to end it, but when you, I'm sorry, Rick, when you add this new legislation, is this going to be on top of the existing $10 per $1,000 that you need to pull a building permit with, that goes to the housing authority? So I'm just wondering, from a budgetary perspective, are we budgeting, if we didn't do something on site, is the proper thing to do budget the 400% of AMI plus the 10,000 per thousand, or is it in lieu of?
So the $10 per thousand construction value, which is what we've currently charged for our housing trust fund under 82I of the statutes, will continue to exist. We're not looking to charge that on. So if you're building a 12-unit development, 3 units affordable, 9 units market rate, you only pay it on the market rate units. You don't have to also pay that on the affordable units that you're providing.
Okay.
So that's the intention.
Again, yeah, on that topic, I do think that's a double tax. So I've said before, you're taxing housing to produce housing. I think you should be taxing other things, tear downs or other things. But anyway, we're not supposed to talk about those other items.
That's on my list though, Rick. It's on my list of future topics because I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Okay, any other thoughts on that number, or do you want to move on to bonuses, which, as Rick indicated, is probably more interesting? All right, well, let's move on. We can always come back if someone has a thought later. Lynn, can you put up the second slide there on the bonus structure? Now that you figured out how to do it. Okay, so the commissioners and those who attended as the public at our last meeting will recall that I'd written a fairly loose statement that kind of just gave the commission open-ended discretion to issue bonuses as we needed to facilitate affordable housing being developed. And at both the advice of our town attorneys and some of you guys, we've tried to rein that in a little so that we stay on the right side of the McKenzie decision. This is mostly taken from Norwalk's regulations. So what I'm proposing right now is a density bonus is available up to 20% of the number of dwelling units per acre in order to facilitate that 15% of the units being affordable. And I am not a math major, but my short and dirty math came out with that's always going to net you an equivalent number, an equivalent increase in market rate units as the amount of affordable units you're going to have to provide, because obviously 20% is greater than 15%. And that's what I was trying to accomplish, is to make the development community more whole by giving them additional market rate units in exchange for the affordable units. Oh, my little arrows didn't come out. So what you can see here, this is just my quick calculations this morning. The multifamily zone currently allows 4 to 6 dwelling units per acre. And you can see what that would become with a 20% bonus. Apartment currently allows 8.7, that would become 10.4 with a 20% bonus. And the retail and business zones allow 29 dwelling units per acre, and that becomes 34.8. So that's what we're looking at in terms of bonuses. And then in order to accommodate those bonuses, I recognize that you've got to allow some leverage, some variation in some of the other site restrictions. So what I've put out there for now is an additional story or 10 additional feet of height, the ability to modify coverage, setbacks, or landscape area or recreation area by 10% from what's required. And then we've heard from several of you that parking is a big issue. So I have put some stuff down here to modify parking. This comes with the warning that I think we have several members of the commission who are fairly hesitant to modify parking at all. So this is this may be a push or an ask that I don't know if I can achieve with the commission, but I'm hopeful that you guys can help me get to something that maybe they will listen to. And also on my list is further down the road, we have to have, as a commission, some conversations about our philosophy on parking in New Canaan. But that's not something we're going to accomplish right now. So anyway, I know this is different than what you guys saw at the end of August, so I'm open to your thoughts on what I've put down here.
So maybe I'll jump in on this one early. If you exempt your affordables and you bonus them 1 for 1 or a little bit more, whatever, I think you have a simpler model and can reach a more usable equation. So that if you were allowed to do 10 units and you had to do,
Make it 20 units because 15% is 3.
all right, so you were going to do a 20 unit project and you had to have 3 affordables, then you could have 3 affordables added on to your 20 units and 3 market rate added on to your 20 units. So you'd have 26 units. That's a simpler bonus formula, encourages on-site, et cetera. And I just think it would be simple. I'm not that familiar with all these zones in New Canaan to see practically, what could they really yield. So in terms of that, I think a 1 for 1 and all exempt idea would be simpler and better.
Rick, can I just ask a question about that before you go on?
Sure.
So in my mind, and this sounds different than what you're saying, if you were building 20 units and you're required to have 3 of them affordable, then we would give you 3 market rate, but that wouldn't equal 26, that would equal 23. Because the 3 affordable would come out of the 20 and then plus 3. And you
correct. And that comes from when I first wrote some of this zoning, I got a lot of pushback from the development community. And what the development community said was, you are taking away our rights and adding in an affordability. So what we did was say, you know what, that's a good point. if you're allowed to do 20 under your regs now with no affordability, and now you have to do 3, you're taking away our development rights, which gets into a whole nother discussion. So it became, that's what we did, was say, okay, you get, they're in addition, they're exempt to the calculation and in addition, and it became a true bonus. So that's how that evolved, and it's worked pretty well. So I just think that that's kind of a fair way to do it. You're not taking away anybody's rights.
Right, and
It
Krista,
also allows developments or, projects to go above the minimum. Whereas if you're only going to get that percentage, regardless of what you provide, then you're probably only going to get the minimum.
I'm not sure I follow that. Sorry.
but Krista, I'll add, go ahead, Ray, I'm sorry.
Well, in some cases, there are projects that may, if they reach a certain level of affordability, they get other funding sources like, CHAFA or other things. But if you're just looking at it from a private development standpoint, then yeah, the set minimum works because the developer is really only going to do the minimum.
So to translate that, what happens and happened was, if you have a nonprofit or a housing authority, you need to have a cap. So in other words, you have to do a minimum of 15%. Well, what if you wanted to do 20%? You wanted to do 4 affordables. Could you then do 28 units? So depending upon how you ultimately write it, you may want to build in a cap to the density.
Right. And Krista, just to elaborate on what Rick was saying, just in a real world setting, as developers, we go to contract and say, okay, we can build X amount of units per the zoning, and we know that the cost is Y and the revenue we'll receive from them is Z. But so if we then have to subtract from that number to afford to build the affordables, we've now have to redo all of our math. If we can do it as a bonus where we can get the additional market rate units to offset the cost to build the affordable because it's a bonus, then it makes it much easier to do it on site.
Okay.
And that's why I think the different math that Rick described was 26 units, not 23 units, because the 23 units would mean a reduction, a severe reduction in revenue with an increase in cost. The 26 units is an increase in cost, but also a little bit of an increase in revenue because those market rates, that market rate unit provides the bonus to allow you to afford to build the affordable unit. That
Right.
make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Rick, that's the formula in Stanford, isn't it? For and the requirement's 10%.
Yeah, there's a lot of different formulas, and I try when I'm in New Canaan not to talk about Stanford. Talk about all the stuff we've done in Westport in terms of some of those things. So anyway, if that's my thoughts on that topic. If we want to move on to the height, I have a comment on that, or we can continue with the percentages, et cetera, in the bonus with the units.
This is Art. I'm just going to add one thing. And Rick, I understand your analytic, but think about this from another perspective. If suddenly you had 20 developable units and the bonus lets you go to 26 rather than 23, you've just had a 30% increase in eligible units, and you're still only getting the 3 affordables. And this gets down to drafting. I understand the implications of this all the way through, but if you're suddenly talking about significant incentives to the developer, which you are with these bonuses, and Krista, this really goes back to you. I'm not certain that we just want to inadvertently say that you can suddenly go to 26 units rather than 20, have 30% more units, and only end up with a net of 3 in a project.
So that's, I think, a longer debate that in terms of, what I've always been working on in the towns that are 830G vulnerable 830G towns, it's really generating the moratoria points that you need to stay focused on. it's not necessarily number of units, because you're never going to get to 10%. So you're never going to be out of that. And so you need to get your moratoria. So your points for moratoria come from a whole different variety of things, including income levels and size of units. So talking about points is different, but I understand the math. If you do the math from the other side of the equation, 3 divided by 26 is not 15%. It's like whatever, 12 or whatever percent it
It's
is.
12, yeah.
Yeah. So I certainly understand that. But again, if what we're trying to do is incentivize developers, the private sector to do the public's work, then, you know, it's an incentive and it works and it produces housing and produces it on site better, rather than people just waiting till your next moratoria, you know, runs out or something and then hits you with an 830G. So that's been our focus. So that's why I say it that way, but I understand your math.
Yeah, and there's a simple way to deal with this issue, right? Which is the one that we stated at the public meeting about 2 weeks ago now, which is that when we're done, and Krista, we may need to add language, is that a key objective for any approval coming before the committee is to, above all, not do damage to our overall 830G targets. Rick, I appreciate your point about, you know, we're taking, quote, the developer's rights away. We are not. The state of Connecticut has, via 830G, caused that to happen. We should not be unclear about the fact that we are complying with that rule, whether we like it or not, right? And so the real focus needs to be that a reasonable application coming before P&Z, when it's done, should above all add to units, but also not do damage. So it's only a matter of, you know, and I don't object, for example, if we want to give a bonus to go to 26, and as long as the resultant number of units was higher than 10%, and therefore contributes both to moratoria points and to actual 830G, then that's fine. I think that the public should correctly say, when we provide bonuses, are we doing so in a way that works effectively with the development community and services the needs of our community's P&Z objectives?
Art, I think that's really interesting, because the way you describe that of, you know, 15% is what you need, but if we give a bonus, it can't be below 10, because what that does is in other municipalities, and I think Richard mentioned 10% is the number they use for their affordable component. So if you could do it in this scenario where the 26 units, you know, you're building 15% on the original, but it's not less than 10 on the bonus number, if that makes sense, then that alleviates, you know, the argument of should it be 10% or 15%, and incentivize people to build it, because as I mentioned before, we can now afford to build those units.
Yeah, and my point is there's a middle ground here that can make sense to help incentivize development. I'm not so smart that I can figure out whether it's 12.2 or, you know, 10.999. We just need to be understanding that the provision of these bonuses has to yield the takeaway.
Yeah, no, actually, I thought your math was great. You know, 15, but not less than 10. That's a nice, clean, simple way to do it.
I can see that.
So
Who else does someone else have something to say on this? Sorry, maybe it was you, Rick.
I think I agree with Arthur's point. You should be able to satisfy both of those equations simultaneously. So going to the height, I think, you know, creating a one additional story is certainly a minimum. The 10 feet in height doesn't necessarily always work. In terms of, if you have a mixed use development, you might have, retail or some other use that has more floor to floor demand. So I would say one additional story and leave the height out. Also, how you measure the height gets very tricky. Most municipalities that I've worked in prefer under building parking rather than surface lots. And so when you start to build under a building and you get into average grades and what sticks out and ventilating garages, it can get into a whole different set of circumstances where you can't make one story work. But I mean, one story, one story can work, but not the additional height, or depending on how you measure stories, below grade parking all of a sudden became a story and now you lost it. So if you want to keep it flexible between what you did the last time, which was max flexibility, just say one additional story and you can measure it from, the primary street frontage, or, you just don't do it the way you normally do it. So you build in that flexibility. I don't think you need to add a height limitation. Nobody's going to go in and build, if you're allowed to build 3 stories and now you can build 4, nobody's going to build, 80 feet tall. It's self-regulating the actual height.
Okay. Lynn, since you deal more with the height stuff than I do, with applications coming forward, does that make sense to you?
It does make sense. We might have to, so we're not running afoul of Mackenzie, might have to just specify something further. But we could probably make it work. We just have to tweak the language. Thank you for the thought, Rick.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll look at that. We'll talk to some architects, and if you're measuring from a street frontage and you take away that average grade deterrent, then maybe you could make it 15 feet or something. We'll talk to architects and we can play with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the New Canaan also has 2 height limitations where it's your height, which is the midpoint, and then the total height. So you may want to just hang on one sec, Shell. Like kind of pick one and go with it so it's cleaner, because otherwise you start to dictate the roof lines that do and don't work.
Right.
Yeah,
So in the regulation, I just paraphrased it here, but it's the maximum building height as opposed to the total building height.
Yeah, see, I think
Total
most towns use midpoint of the roof. That's most consistent in most municipalities. You start messing with the peak when you're dealing with an architectural character issue, you encourage a lot of flat roofs, which, some people like, some people don't. But it does crimp your design capability when you do it to the actual height. So
Yeah,
I wouldn't, yeah.
I'm sorry, there's also a difference between, habitable space and, for example, what Rick was saying about architectural. I think the town probably prefers that, maybe some type of, there's mechanicals on the top of a building. If you put some type of screening up so that it looks more attractive and you don't see all those mechanicals, does that go against the height or not? So that's why I think he thinks there's a lot of things of flexibility that should just go in front of the commission to say, this makes sense.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to coverage, setbacks, and landscaped areas, the problem with taking a percentage like 10% is if you have, a setback that's 10 feet, you made it 1 foot.
Right.
So you're better off with Mackenzie to say a standard, so your setback's 5 feet, rather than a percentage. You should give the commission, and it should be may allow. It shouldn't be shall allow, so that in the context and depending upon what's going on around the development, you may not want to give any relief in a particular situation. So you want to maintain some control, but I think you also need to set some standard that's like 5 feet for a setback, and think about how that might, commission may allow, because you can always deny it in a context, and you can support it in your record, and somebody would be crazy to challenge you on it.
Could I interject for a second?
Yeah.
So going back to Dan Steinberg's point about equipment on the roofs, we already allow for exemptions to the height for like appurtenances on the roof, like mechanical equipment, like HVAC and even stairwells, elevator shafts, and like cooling towers and stuff. We make you put it 10 feet off the edge of the roof, and it can't exceed a height and vertical height of 10 feet above what's allowed. And it can't take more than a 20% horizontal area on the roof. That's probably where we pull the 10 feet in additional height from. So maybe we just need to tweak that. But
Yeah, no, I remember that, thank you, Lynn. But I remember, I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be contradictory rulings, if that made sense.
Yeah, so,
Ron,
but so you
I have to
allow
run.
that.
Thank you.
Well, go ahead.
I have to run, but thank you,
Oh,
everyone.
Thank you
Okay,
so much, Richard.
so long.
thank you.
So I think the all those things going up on the roof make it even more important to be able to have an architectural treatment to screen that. And especially in a context, depending upon where the building is, you know, sometimes you can't see anything on the roof. You keep it 10 feet back, you can't see anything. Other times there could be a building next door that, you know, it's going to look pretty bad because you're looking down on it. So being able to go up with a roof makes it look like a mansard roof or whatever the architectural treatment, and looks a lot better than looking at that equipment. It also adds a sound barrier. Get involved with a lot of concerns about AC units on the roof. And so by allowing that architectural feature, and that's another way we've treated it in different municipalities, is, you know, you can give some flexibility to architectural treatments of another X feet.
Mm, okay.
So I don't know how much time we have, but on to parking. And so this is why I've been writing parking regulations longer than affordability regulations. So learned a few things over the years on here. Just to clarify, if you have one space per unit, you're saying that, is that one space per unit for all of your units, or one space per unit for your affordable units? What was the intent?
The intent was for all of the residential units.
Okay.
You'd have them, because what we didn't want was, for instance, if you're doing a 10-unit development, you come to us and say, okay, well, we're going to put in 5 EV charging stations and a car share spot, and therefore we're not going to provide any specific parking for the residents.
Right.
Like, we didn't want to get below a certain number.
Correct. I think there's so many things racing through my brain here. So I think you may want to word it that the commission may allow, because there are areas where there are plenty of on-street parking and municipal lots and all these other things. And there are other places where there are none. And so you don't want to make it a rule that you can do it anywhere. Again, you want to have the commission may allow it. I'm all for all kinds of parking reduction. Shared use, obviously, you know, with on the site or nearby, that's great. That's perfect. Reduction when you have electric charging unit, I'm not sure how that works. If someone is trying to encourage electric charging, I don't think that creates a reduction in parking. In some instances, it can create an increased demand in parking because, you know, you're going to put one space for electric charging, and what? I'm going to go charge my car and leave it there overnight? No, you want me charging my car, taking my car out of there, parking somewhere else so somebody else can charge overnight. So I think I'm not sure that that's a good tool, but I'm all for any tool that reduces parking, but I'm not so sure the rationale of that one. And similarly on the reduction of shared vehicles. So these are regs that we've created elsewhere. 5 spaces for one is, I think, a little generous. We've been using 4 spaces for one. You know, the objective here is that people would actually share a vehicle. It's hard to share vehicles. You need management of it, and you know, it works in some cases, but 5 is pretty generous. Again, I'm all for it, but I'm trying to give you like my feedback of experience. But as long as, and I think there's another
So
one.
could I jump in to Rick? Because
Sure.
I'm sorry, but I have to actually run out. But I agree totally with what Rick just said. I think the last 2 sub-bullets are environmental. They don't deal with the practicalities that we need to deal with in terms of low income and satisfying 830G. They will only make it more complicated, and they mix up what we're trying to do. So I think that the reduction for shared use, if we have a signed agreement with a third party that will provide housing that will be in place, is fine. I'm sorry, I do have to jump, but I totally appreciate, Rick, your input on those items.
Thanks. Yeah, just to the point, Arthur's got to leave, but the shared vehicles actually do work for affordability, because people, you know, your 2 biggest expenses are housing and your cars. So if you know that you can have, you know, you don't need it for work, let's say, but you do want to have access to a car, you can save a lot of money by having a shared vehicle. And the way we've done shared vehicles is they're provided by it's mostly in rentals, they're provided by the unit, you know, the owner of the building, and they're at no cost. You just have to put gas in. So you don't have to rent them. It's not like a zip car that you're renting. It's not a third-party zip car. It's there, you sign up for it, just like you'd sign up to play tennis at a certain time, you sign up to use your car at a certain time. So, and there was one other thing, Ray. What was the other thing we wanted to add to the parking? What was our other suggestion on parking?
Well, I think we talked a little bit about shared parking between uses that have different peaks. So in a mixed use development, I don't know if you have that elsewhere in your regs already, but that's always something. And I think you had language in there, you know, subject to a parking analysis and a third party review, which is fair. But then you have, you know, the ability to double use spaces that are going to be sitting empty at certain points in the day. So
Right.
Shared parking,
certainly office and
calculations.
residential share very nicely because usually people are at one place or the other.
So Ray, this is Lynn. In response to your comment, we do have in 6.2E, in our parking regulations, we allow for reduction of parking facilities for shared uses. And specifically, we also allowed for a reduction of up to 25% of the required parking spaces. Usually it's a maximum of 5 spaces in the retail B, business A, business B, business C, and business D zones. All of those are key downtown zones that actually require parking be provided.
Yeah, so you can the way you're anticipating this is all your other tools in the toolbox can be used.
Yes, that
Okay.
would be the, yes.
Yeah, all right.
But we
I'm not-
want, at the end of the day, Rick, our goal was that, as Krista said before, we didn't want someone to use everything so that they end up building a building, but then provide no parking. We wanted to provide a limit, but the question is, what's a realistic limit to say, you know, you have to provide a certain number of minimum parking. And that's where we sort of came down and said, well, for the residential uses, you have to provide a minimum of 1 space per unit. And if you provide that and you provide your affordable housing on site, then here, go at it. Here's some other ways to reduce your parking.
Right. One of the things that we've done, and actually we are about to file on Dan's behalf in Westport, an entire section on parking management. So what we'll do is we're going to file it this week and we'll get you a copy of what we're doing. And what we've said is, and to this exact point, is we've said, whatever your uses are on your site, you have to be able to self-park 75% to meet your normal regulation. So whether you're office or retail or housing or medical or whatever it is, if you can self-park 75%, you can use all these other strategies to reduce that 25%. So you've got a similar thing here with a 25%, but we don't cap it at 5 spaces. Okay.
Right.
So we'll get you a copy of that, and we'll get it before, your hearing next week. Because, and again, I appreciate getting something on the books, doing it simple and getting it done. So we'll try to stay focused so we can help you kind of do that, but we'll get you that anyway, because it's going to be a very useful tool, and it's proximity to a bus or bus shelter, and it's got valet car elevators, stackers. Every strategy that we've used everywhere is potential. Again, may not be much of a call for it, all those different things, but they're all strategies that we've used successfully.
And Lynn, what's interesting about what Rick wrote about that as it relates to Westport is it allows you, the owner, the flexibility to meet the needs, but there's also I think a yearly kind of check-in with the Planning and Zoning Commission to show what you're doing and making sure that you're meeting the needs. So it keeps a little bit of oversight to make sure that you don't have an issue.
And, and some of it is kind of commonsensical. So for example, and I think your regs do the same thing, medical requires more than office, for example. You have a higher parking ratio. And that's from the days back when they used to, put you in a waiting room and you were there for an hour till the doctor saw you. And that's where all those extra parking things happened. That isn't as true now. And the other thing is valet for doctors' offices. Many times, you're dropping someone off, et cetera. Anyway, that's a whole nother topic, but we'll get you a copy of what that is. But we think you're moving in the right direction, giving that flexibility to modify your parking standards.
Thank you, Rick. I think Scott has his hand up, so I just wanted to let Scott jump in.
Yeah,
And then David.
me too as well.
Okay.
Changing topic, a little bit of topics, and I apologize, I'm gonna have to leave here soon too. I noticed inside the reg that we're talking about 80% of state median income. For 830G, I think you get like 50% more points for doing like 60% of affordable. And then there's also some questions about age restriction or disability or other categories of affordable, all of which will become important for New Canaan. Is there, actually a question toward the developers probably, is it realistic that 60% would ever be chosen? Or how would the incentives have to change to get to 60%? And thereby maximize, again, how much more, how many points we get toward 830G.
So
Well,
let me just answer
I'll defer
first.
to you, Rick.
Yeah, just let
But I
me.
was just going to say, Rick and I had this discussion, lots of times, and what we talked about was, and this gets into what Rick is saying about points, that there are different ways to get points, and you can have a whole formula, like a 3-bedroom that is at 60% versus this. And so I think it really comes down to, in our mind, is do you want to create a very more detailed, that will take a little more time, calculation of how you can get those points, or do you want to do something a little simpler that says it's 80% of SMI? As a developer, the way we look at it is, if you're going to do the bonus that we've discussed, which we would hope would be the 1-for-1, then it's okay for us to say, okay, all of our affordable units will be at the 60% or 80% of whatever the code was, 80% of SMI. If you're going to, as Rick alluded to earlier, eat into our stock of market rate units to get to convert to affordable units, then we're going to want the ability to maybe not, to get 6 points out of 4 units. right? Because then at least we'll have more market rate units. So I think, and Rick can elaborate, but I think it's kind of either or. Either you give us the bonus, then we can afford to do the 80%, or we need the flexibility to try to get more points from less units so we can afford to build those.
So, yeah, and so Scott, it's a great question, and we can get you the sort of different breakdowns because there's housing equivalent from 830G. I think, Arthur, I said this in public at the last meeting. I think Arthur is a little bit hung up on the, you have to be more than 10%, otherwise we're losing ground. And I don't believe in that philosophy because you're never going to get to 10%. It's really a matter of getting points. So if you want to incentivize, points as opposed to units, you can do that. And we've done that. We do that all the time. And it just goes to what philosophically you're trying to accomplish. What we thought with this particular reg and counting heads and votes, there's just so much you're going to be able to accomplish in the next, 8 days. So we're happy to give you all that information of the housing equivalent. We've talked about, as long as you develop a minimum, let's say with the example we were using, that, you had to produce 3 affordable units. You could say you have to produce a minimum of 3 points. Okay, and you might be able to do that by doing 1 3-bedroom, at 60% AMI and get 3 points for that. And you only have mathematically one, but you got your points. So
one thing that Art, I had the same argument with Art the other day. And one thing that I finally kind of got and understand a little bit more is that we have like the whole desegregate Connecticut movement out there that really doesn't care about 830G. All they care about is the affordable housing and progress in affordable housing. And so I think that, in writing these rules, it's important to pay attention to both issues. That one, we have the immediate issue of 830G. 2, you have the bigger issue of whatever anybody else equates to affordable housing. And if you're not making progress at a more than 10% rate on the affordable housing, forget the points, forget 830G. Now we're vulnerable to the other desegregate Connecticut side. At least I think that's what he was interpreting on his.
So there's a couple.
I'm going to call in and I'll keep listening, but I got to head out from this call. But keep going.
Yeah.
There's a couple different ways that we've approached it too. I think in Westport, and we were involved in the bulk of their projects that produced moratoria points. Westport, I think, got it that they weren't chasing the 10% anymore, and were very focused on producing points. In Stamford, where it's not an 830G vulnerable municipality, they're just very focused on producing housing and producing affordable housing, as much of it as they could. So when you start to set your minimums, if you raise the minimum to 20%, 30%, on paper, you're requiring a greater number of affordability, but you're going to get fewer projects. So you need to try to hit that target of producing or incentivizing the development that's going to produce the units.
But I think for the 1 week we have to do this,
Yeah,
I agree, Scott. You don't have the votes on this commission to generate any formula that's going to be less than 10%.
Right.
So we have,
Sorry, that's me. There we
so I
go.
think somebody should be muted. Okay, there we go.
I think it's
So-
Scott.
Okay, so I think, for this exercise, how can we produce the best reg in 8 days? I think, unfortunately, that's too much to tackle.
I agree.
I really think we should keep it simple and let an applicant that can come in, if we were working with David on a particular project where he could go buy something, but he needed some seed money, and then he could do something at a lower level, we could bring that in as a poster child for, hey, change the regs because we're going to produce larger units at lower income with, the housing authority or with David or however, that's working. But I just think it's too much for them to do and absorb in 8 days.
Yeah, I would say, Krista, just to elaborate on what Ray said, it's really a philosophical issue for the board members of, are you trying to create more affordable housing units? Or are you trying to create more moratoria points so you don't have to get slammed by the state imposing things on you? And
Right.
like any other board, you probably don't have a consensus.
Right.
So that's why, the comments we've made are about keeping it so that we can build more units, because that seems to be, the driving force for the majority of people without, from what we've heard, or what I've heard at least.
I'm going to respond to that in a minute, but I want to let Dave go because Dave.
Yeah, I gotta run as well, but there was one point I wanted to make about this reg before I run. In the business zones, you regulate density through FAR. And so I think if you're going to seek out a density bonus, you need to make that bonus applicable to FAR as well. Otherwise, you're just cramming more units into the same box of development, which I don't think is really what you want to do.
Really
And the developer may tell you it don't work anyway. Like adding more height under the same FAR just doesn't do anything really.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, so the FAR should be the same way. You exempt the affordables and you exempt the bonus units. And you start with your base FAR and you exempt from there. And that would take care of that.
That's
So
what I was thinking as well.
Just to jump in, we already do exempt the affordables in the business zone, especially in the business A.
So now you have to exempt the bonus ones too. So
Okay.
if you end up at a 1-for-1 kind of bonus situation, you've got to exempt those, because otherwise you're just decreasing, or as David says, you're cramming more units in the same box for your
Okay.
bonus units. So you got to exempt them.
Maybe we need to tweak the language because we already exempt for the building floor areas that relate to residential uses when it's part of affordable housing development as part of it. But maybe we just need to tweak the existing language further.
Well, that would
And
be
then
good.
I read that to be applicable only when it's an affordable housing development, which is this sort of specific
So maybe
terminology.
to your point, David, maybe we take the word development out and when we reword it and say something like when affordable housing is part of the development.
Yeah, something like that. All right, it was good seeing you all. I got to run.
Thank you, David, for attending.
Take care.
Hey, David.
Thanks for inviting me.
So on that point, I think I would be clear that you're only exempting the affordables and the bonus units. You don't want to get rid of a floor area ratio totally, especially when you see $1,100 a square foot units being produced. Developers will want to produce larger units. So I think you want to just exempt the extra stuff and leave the base the way it is.
Okay, good point. Thank you.
Rick, back to your previous point, or the point that both you and Dan were making about points versus units. I understand what you're saying, and I think ultimately we will have to have that philosophical conversation. I think for getting something done next week that, where we've spent our time for the last 6 months is focused on units, and I don't think changing course at the 11th hour is going to do us any good. So I think this is where we're start. And like you said, I think we will have projects come and we're going to learn and things are going to have to get revised. And that's going to be the process we go through. As I've said from the beginning, this is really meant to be a starting point, definitely not the ending point.
Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that's also why we, have made some comments about how the bonuses work and things, because if you're going to do it that way, let's do it in a way that, I think the goal is, as developers, is we do projects to produce the units you want us to produce.
Right. And I mean, my worst nightmare is that this produces something terrible. So, we want to be able to work with the development community to produce good projects that contain affordable units so that we can then say, look, this is great. We need more of this in our community, rather than, wow, the first one was a total disaster. We're never going to do that again.
Well, we
Right.
can't talk about our development, but we're
Right.
happy to be your poster child.
Well, that's also where if you write your regulations that the commission may allow, you're not writing a new standard that's just raises the bar, period. You know, you leave yourself some discretion in a context to say, you know what, that height doesn't work here because,
Right,
and then you can control it.
right. Okay, well, so we technically have about 15 more minutes left. I feel like we've covered pretty much everything, so I don't want to keep anyone past, time just to make small talk. But if there's anything else that you guys want to share, I'm open to it. Otherwise, Lynn and I are going to go back and work on this. And
I think what we can try to do during this week is, I don't know when you were going to sort of send it back out and post it, but maybe what we can do over the next couple of days, and we can be in touch with Lynn, is, make some suggestions on some of these things and get it to you, and then, we'll see. Because there were a couple of other points that I'm trying to remember.
so Rick, that would actually be super helpful if you wanted to just like redline a draft of this and send it, your comments back to Lynn. I mean, I've taken a lot of notes here, but seeing, how you would do this in your own terms, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so we'll try to do that and help you. And we're trying not to get into, other philosophical discussions about whether the market rate units, should have it. I mean, I think it's worth you discussing, but that's not gonna, that's not the big picture. And hopefully someone will bring in a project that, will either be able to use these regs or be able to say, well, here's my reg, it's yours, but we need also to do something else. I would also make sure that that's clearly a part of your record, that this is a starting point. Because what happened in Westport, they wrote a regulation called Inclusionary Housing Zone, IHZ. And I gave them a 6-page analysis of their regulation and what we suggested should be changed. And the chairman at the time was very particular about not changing. You're much more flexible and you're changing a lot of things on the fly. He thought if you changed anything, you had to go re-advertise and start all over. And so he asked me, are you saying we should, scrap this and start all over? And I said, no, don't do that, because you'll probably never do it. Do it, but then allow people to make the modifications. And then then the board changed. Okay. So there was a different chair, a different control. And the first person that came in to try to change it, they said, no, we just adopted it. Why don't we wait and see if it works?
Yeah.
So I would encourage you to put on the record that you're doing this, not as etched in stone.
Right, fair point. Okay, well, if that's everything, thank you guys so much for taking the time. This is, incredibly helpful, and we're gonna do our best. So send us your comments and
Right.
see you next
Thank you.
Tuesday.
And
See you
thanks for
next
listening to
Tuesday.
our
Thank
input. We
you.
really appreciate the
Appreciate it.
interaction.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you for being on. It's appreciated.
Anytime. Thanks.